does Europe matter? And why is it in a mess? And what's next? Well, first of all, does Europe matter? With only 326 millions in the United States, we are significantly smaller in terms of population. The EU has a total of 512 million. Average per capita income here is close to $59,000 a year, against 49,000 to 50,000 in the EU. Individual countries, of course, excel. Luxembourg has an income of $105,000 per capita, roughly twice that of the United States. We're on a par with the Netherlands. Averages can mislead, though. There's a gulf in wealth between the richer nations to the north and the west of Europe, and the poorer nations to the south and the east. Those in the north enjoy levels of income around the same as we have here, but those in the south and the east suffer from levels less than half of this, typically $18,000 a head. The poorest, Bulgaria, $8,000 a head. And the health divide is just as strong. Spaniards living in Madrid expect to live to 85, 12 years more than the good folk of Hungary. Let's just look a little bit more closely. We're our own best customers. Total trade in all goods and services between the United States and the European Union amounts to $1.2 trillion per annum. The United States has a slight balance of trade deficit, 59 billion. Insignificant, almost an error factor in such a vast area of statistics. Either Europe or the United States is the largest trade and investment partner for every country in the globe. Together, we account for 50% of world GDP. And furthermore, the cultural wealth of the 28 nations is so massive, its history is so rich, and its artistic record so deep as to be a source of endless wonder, pleasure, study, and recreation. Just to review the region's cultural contribution is to travel from ancient Greece through Rome to Venice, to the Spain of Columbus, to Florence and the Renaissance, to the Reformation, Bruges, ultimately to Paris and to London. Let's get rid of Britain, by the way, from this story. We could say that modern Europe, certainly its subliminal memory, began on October the 21st, 1805, when 27 British ships led by Admiral of the Fleet Lord Nelson defeated the French and the Spanish at Trafalgar. We Brits love this, by the way. I can go on about Battle of Trafalgar and things like that forever. Not, and there's a significance here, a really massive geopolitical significance. Not for a century would Britain again be challenged at sea. The British Empire followed with its engine of wealth, and this is the important point. It did so far from the continental mass of Europe. The Channel would serve throughout as an impenetrable defense. In geopolitical terms, it allowed Britain always to remain hesitant about its true allegiance to the European cause, to play the options, to sit on the fence. Churchill was proud of Britain's special relationship with you, with America, whom he also patronizingly called the New World. He focused his real passion on our empire. And although he was an enthusiast for Europe, he always spoke of them, of their challenges, rather than us and our challenges. And for Mrs. Thatcher, there was never a serious question of an alternative to British sovereignty. Frankly, she saw much of the debate as entirely idealistic flim-flam. She said to me one day, Can't we stop these constant references to European unity? It'll never come about. But whilst Britain and the United Kingdom prospered, the nations on the continental mainland were to suffer an altogether different experience. The Napoleonic Wars of the turn of the 19th century set the pattern. We hear today of the period as being one of French glory, romance, and genius, but reality was different. Whilst British trade doubled between 1796 and 1816, France ran out of funds, and it also ran out of manpower. It endured, under Napoleon, a series of massive land battles that broke the back of its manhood. 12,000 died at Friedland, 44,000 at Aspen, 300,000 in Spain, 450,000 in the Russian campaign, 200,000 at Leipzig, and so on. 1 million men. 30% of France's prime manhood killed. Few historians remark today how by Waterloo in 1815, Napoleon, like Hitler in 1945, had all but run out of experienced soldiery, and he too was using children as conscripts. Napoleon's legacy to Europe was one of death, destruction, and despotism. And much of modern-day Europe, remember, did not even exist in the 19th century. All that was to change with the efforts of Bismarck in the 1870s. Bismarck brought together the principalities, created modern Germany, and immediately attacked France in the Franco-Prussian War of 1870. It only lasted 5 months. It was short-lived, but more than 1 million people were killed yet again. Humiliated, the French ego in tatters. And here's the thing, the ripples of its humiliation would last to today. France was forced to hand over Alsace and Lorraine in reparations, and these were the lands that in turn France would seize back at the end of World War I in 1918, and which would then form part of Hitler's justification for warmongering in the 1930s as he sought the return of what he claimed to be Germany's rightful land. Elsewhere in Europe, a different, insidious, and dangerous economic trend was emerging. The further east and south you travel, the more subsistent, rural, and uncompetitive are the economies. They had failed to take advantage of the Industrial Revolution. They had failed to adapt. They were living on borrowed time, on myths that would be shattered during the next 40 years. 20 million Europeans died in the fighting between 1914 and 1918. And then a further 20 millions in the Spanish flu epidemic that followed. But what is often ignored, and what matters so much as we bring this up to the modern day, is that the killings did not stop with the armistice in 1918. Throughout Europe, and especially the further east and south you went, the killings continued, and they would mold the psyche of the nations as they try to cooperate and survive today. Any understanding of Europe today must include these terrible and ongoing local wars, social upheavals, reprisals, religious and tribal killings. They continued throughout the period, what Churchill called the unknown wars, and they stretched with greater or lesser pain from 1918 to the end of the 1930s, and a further 10 million died. There was no hiding place. Instead, there were more than 27 violent exchanges of political power, civil wars, and ongoing actions of terror in just the 5 years following 1918. Remember, all these nations were new, and they were economically and politically vulnerable. All needed new structures, new institutions, new identities to help them cope with the responsibility of government. In the main, their populations were small, They had little industry. They were struggling throughout to accommodate a complex ethnic mix. Poland, 60% Polish, 10% German, 10% Lithuanian, 10% Russian, and 10% Czech. For them all, nationhood was a priority, the imperative, economic survival. And then came the crash of the New York stock market of 1929. When in July 1933 the index stopped falling, 25% of the American workforce were out of a job. But the world had gone global. The US depression hit Europe like a sledgehammer. In Germany, nearly 50% were out of work. In 3 years, the German economy declined by 16%. Dictatorships emerged in Hungary, Austria, Latvia, Poland, Italy, Spain, Portugal. France had 44 governments between 1920 and 1940. And then in 1933, Adolf Hitler became the Chancellor of Germany. World War II ushered in a repeat of the whole terrible process. The killings, destruction, and sufferings all over. Only this time, there was the added dimension of Stalin and the USSR. And once again, historians have ignored the aftermath, because the war did not stop with Hitler's defeat. Nothing like. Especially in the East, civil wars continued to rage as they had done 15 years earlier. Most countries there record fighting until the last hated Soviet soldier left. And here too the reality can be a shock. 1989 in Poland. A couple of years later, 1991 for Estonia, Lithuania, and Latvia. This aftermath saw one other unexpected and largely ignored event that will echo down the hallways of history to this day. Many of the newly formed nations effectively took the earlier racial efforts of the Nazis to their logical conclusion and expelled all of those who were not indigenous. Tens of millions were forcibly, often violently expelled in the biggest act of ethnic cleansing that the world has ever seen. The culture of racial diversity that had been so rich a feature of the European empires was dealt a death blow. And the first target, of course, were the Germans. Murdered, tortured, expelled from non-German countries. Tens of thousands died from malnutrition and disease. In all, more than 12 million indigenous Germans were expelled from the new nations in the East, in particular Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, and Romania. There were still hundreds of thousands in refugee camps in the early 50s. The ongoing death toll was enormous. Now, this talk is about the crisis facing Europe today and the massive part that history plays in the cumulative psyche of nations. It is highly significant that it was not only the Germans who were expelled. Now was the time for revenge, for wholesale cleansing, and for bitter and small reckonings. The Slovaks expelled Hungarians, as did Romania. Albanians were driven out of Greece. Italians from Yugoslavia, Turks from Bulgaria, and so on. Eastern Europe, by the early 1950s, was a vast churn of refugees, lost peoples, and increasingly xenophobic, ethnically concentrated, and hostile states. The emotional memory was set for the threatening climate of today. A rejection of foreigners, of immigrants, of people who might not be like us, and an introverted focus on ourselves to the exclusion of others. So what about the EU? How did it come about? Well, it wasn't until 1951 that the concept of a European trade area was established, and it had just 6 members: Belgium, France, Germany, Italy, and Luxembourg, with the Netherlands. No Britain. We were still happily sitting on the fence. The European Union today has grown to be a community of 28 nations. It has survived the Cold War It has helped to bring about the collapse of the Soviet Union. It is a monumental achievement, a powerhouse of trade and technology. It has understood that the heart of economic growth is the free flow of goods and people and the no less free flow of technology, and it has worked. Half of the members were enjoying GDP growth rates of over 3% in 2017. It's embraced globalization, and it has a common currency, the euro. The everyday value of the euro compared to the United States dollar is the most widely watched currency relationship. But alas, there we start to see some of the challenges being faced by the Union today. In fact, only 19 of the members have so far converted to the euro. Great Britain in particular, still conflicted, still happily sitting on the fence, has remained protective of sterling and of London as the de facto financial capital of Europe. I'm going to leave Brexit to another day if you'll have me back.
After they leave. James, talk after they leave.
I'll talk, give you a talk after they leave. Thank you so much, that's kind. That's it, yeah, great.
Good news.
Let's look at the current mess. What went wrong? Remember all that history I've just given you. The first members all belonged to the affluent North and the West. However, political thinking evolved. And by the 1980s, the Commission suddenly, and I believe quite wrongly, saw its role as a political one, not economic, to include all European countries. A geopolitical drive overcame economic reality. They called it enlargement. And protagonists saw enlargement as valuable in its own right. Greece joined in 1981, Spain and Portugal in 1986, and then in 2004, 12 nations, mostly freed from the yoke of Soviet Russia. They brought with them those tragic histories I've just outlined. Ethnic cleansing that meant that two of those nations, even today, remain virtually monoracial. Poland and Romania, like Japan, have almost no foreign-born citizens. Greece, Hungary, and Czechoslovakia, less than 5%. Most of the new members were economically at risk. Youth unemployment around 10% here in the United States, nearly 32% at the moment in Italy, over 40% in Spain and Greece. The promise of European membership was not just freedom from Russia, it was also a promise of gainful employment, a fast track to joining the haves and an affluent life. But the EU leaders, their eyes set on political enlargement, lent money to countries with little opportunity for growth, let alone for the levels of profitability that would allow them to pay back the debts they embraced to kickstart their economies and give their peoples a shot at a new affluence. They failed to develop the fiscal structures or the physical infrastructure to allow them to weather the inevitable economic storms that came. The economic debacle of 2008 and its aftermath ravaged the new states, especially those who were poorest. It's not difficult to paint another picture of the European experiment as one of economic and social failure. A group of countries unable to resolve the debt burden. Of Greece, with a debt 180% of its current annual GDP. Italy, 131%. Or of the other 9 countries with debt levels over 80%. And we have inevitably to come back to immigration. Don't forget all that ethnic cleansing. Already fences had been constructed between Turkey and Greece to withstand the migrants escaping the wars in the Middle East and the desertification caused by that other global phenomenon, climate change. Global warming across North Africa, destroying historic ways of life and which will not pause for local politicians in rich Europe. And the European Union has done little. It has dithered while states, Hungary, Poland and others with right-wing governments, Italy, Austria, have flaunted the European Convention of Human Rights to resist all new immigrants. In Germany, the ponderous and uncharismatic Merkel has failed a serious challenge from her local right-wing Bavarian coalition partner, Horst Seehofer. Her party is now threatened by both the fascist right and the Green Party, who overtook them in the recent European elections. In France, Macron, now at an historic low in popularity, is confronted by the threat of the yellow shirts and of Marine Le Pen and her fascist followers. In Italy, the new Prime Minister Giuseppe Conte, Interior Minister Matteo Salvini have introduced a populist government. Salvini has commandeered the political conversation, adding attack on the small Roma gypsy population. Salvini's real challenge is nothing to do with the Roma population. It's that his beautiful country is economically divided between the rich north and the poor south. 8% and rising of all Italians live in absolute poverty. But hunting gypsies provides a cheap scapegoat. The new member nations, struggling to find their feet, add a new dimension to the problems. In monoracial Hungary, Viktor Orbán has built his demagogy on attacking immigrants and liberal thinkers. Orbán oligarchs have taken over parts of the media in neighbouring Slovenia and Macedonia to help the populist Slovenian Janša to power. In Poland, Jarosław Kaczynski, the dominant political figure, emotionally deranged by the death of his twin brother, has allied himself with Orbán and Hungary and is busy disbanding the judiciary as a prelude to pushing his own brand of despotism. An East European populist cabal is forming that will destabilize the European Union. Wherever you look, Europe today is facing challenges. And perhaps the greatest is the emergence of this wholly new populist tone, one of that the traditional bureaucrats and old-style politicians simply do not understand and will find, I believe, impossible to resist. In this context, Europe needs once more, if it could ever find it, the steadying hand of a strategically sophisticated and diplomatically commanding friend in the United States. But alas, it's not there. It is as though all hounds of hell have been slipped free on the moment, and no one is there to help. Above all, Europe needs strong leaders of its own. Britain must stay. It must reverse its fatuous decision to leave. It needs a Thatcher. Recently released papers show that the Iron Lady eventually changed her mind and saw the opportunities that the European Union presented. In 1988, she wrote a letter, "We must get this right. Just think what a project this could be. A single market without barriers, direct access to 500 millions of the wealthiest and most prosperous on our doorstep, with a Channel Tunnel to give us direct access." Perhaps, she added, it's not a dream. But alas, gentlemen, we do not have a Thatcher. Europe is in a crisis. My message is sell Europe and sell Britain. Thank you for listening to me.